Hey, welcome back, Veteran Nation fans. And today we have a great show for you. We have an interview with an author. Joining us today is Patricia Wynn Brown. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Skipper.
And you have a book that you've recently written about some of your experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, it's called Royal Roots, and in it I talk about growing up post World War II. I'm a baby boomer, don't hold it against me. And it's about how I used my imagination and creativity and delving into TV and show business in order to deal with my dad, who was ex-Navy man, 7 years in the Navy during the war, but he had severe PTSD. And so he was often volatile and he was depressed and he was anxious, but he also had good dad days. And
Mhm.
so I do talk about that as well. But it has as a background history going on in the 50s and 60s in popular culture, the Kennedys and the Beatles and Ed Sullivan Show. But how a child in that situation faces the reality of her life and makes a very conscious decision at a very, very young age that I'm not going to be hindered by
Mhm.
this. Dad's sick, but I must go on.
Okay. And I do have a link. It's up on the screen right now. For those watching, it is in the description of the show. So if you would like to get a copy for yourself, you'll be able to click that link and go right onto Amazon and buy a copy. Now, let's talk a little bit about your dad because he was in the Navy, and uh, just because just for everyone knows, I actually worked for a long time with your son, and him and I had talked about your dad's service, and he was a survivor of Pearl Harbor, correct? Oh,
My
your
uncle
uncle.
Bob was a survivor of Pearl Harbor on the USS West Virginia, and he was in fact a war hero at Midway as well. My father was stationed in various places, had various jobs. He was looked up to this big brother, Bob. My
Mhm.
dad's Richard. Looked up to this man, and Bob was very handsome, very strong, very able. My dad quit high school to join the Navy during the war. He was 17, he had trouble in school. He went to flight school, he flunked out because of math. Their dad, my grandfather, had been a policeman, became chief of police in Columbus, and he was a very towering, strong figure. He plays into all this as well because he demanded that these four sons of his be heroic. And my dad, um, in his last year in the Navy, and he wanted to stay in the Navy, um, was involved in an incident, which
Mhm.
I had no idea. My mom said some explosion. It was some explosion, but we were never to discuss anything about my dad's mental health inside or outside the house. But in researching Royal Roots, I found out
Okay.
through the Freedom of Information Act, and I received 200 pages of his psychiatric records, which I read these things. I had no idea. I had no
Start
idea.
connecting the dots then.
Connecting the dots. And then there was an incident at Norfolk. So it wasn't in the war, but it was a wartime experience. And because it wasn't in combat, and my dad suffered a complete breakdown after this incident, he felt unworthy because he wasn't fighting.
Mhm.
He had gotten off work. He had just come out of a hangar, gone to bed, and then this explosion happened, and it was kept quiet because it was during the war, and it was a mistake made by the men who were taking Torpex bombs from a ship new British bomb that they don't use anymore, loading it improperly, and then the incident occurred. And then right after, my dad had a complete mental breakdown, and that was he was discharged in 1944 after spending 14 months in a secure psychiatric ward, and then for the rest of his life till he was 60, he was mentally ill. I was born in 1951, and my parents had married. He must have been having a good spell when they got married, and then we dealt with dad's mental illness and until the day he died, which what brought more stigma to the family because it involved the police.
Mhm.
My grandfather died 3 days later. So in the book, it explains all of that, but I have to say, with the stories and the times of the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's a lot of humor because, as we know, the drama is comedy and tragedy, and they're all mixed together. And I come from Irish people, and so dark humor is pretty much part of how we get through, and it's pretty much part of service members' lives. And as we see in the TV series MASH, it's very they're dealing with horrible things, and yet they have their humor to save them, and it has saved me. My sense of humor has saved me.
I can say firsthand, uh, as a veteran, as a wartime veteran, yeah, the dark humor definitely shows itself. Uh, uh, Many people look at us veterans and be like, "Really? That's how you are?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, that's exactly how we are." Um,
Yeah.
Now, I talk a lot about my struggle with PTSD on this show. Uh, you've already hinted at it. You know, PTSD wasn't something that people talked about for many years. And one thing I try to do with this show is try to break that stigma. Because I think, you know, when we talk about it, I think one, we can actually then deal with it. And we also can make it a little bit more normalized. Can you talk a little bit about, as you were reading those psychiatric notes, how that was for you?
What was so apparent to me, and I was always angry at my dad and very mouthy and rebellious, was how terrible he felt about himself as a provider because he didn't work. I never saw my dad go to work like the other dads. And and as he thought as a man. I saw it in a perspective of this 17-year-old who enlists, and I think he enlisted in order to prove himself to his very rigid and controlling dad. It was a revelation to me to see my dad as a human being that struggled, even though we had some very, very bad times. Money was, he didn't care. My mother had to, you know, rob Peter to pay Paul
Hmm.
to keep the roof over our heads and keep us fed while my dad would just go off on to the beer joints or whatever. But I saw him as a human being. And then when I read about what happened and how severe that was and how that incident affected so many people's lives. Finally, an article came out in the paper about the people that were there for this explosion and how it affected them for the rest of their lives. And I thought, oh my gosh, my dad too. I just saw him as you weren't in combat, so you're fine.
Hmm.
Your your body's fine. Go to work. Be a good dad all the time. You're a good dad sometimes. Be a good dad all the time. Why can't you do that? He couldn't. Because with this explosion, also, as we're learning now, explosions change your brain wiring. And this thing was huge and heard 20 miles away, and he was right next to it. Changes your brain, and his changed immediately. So to be able to see my dad that way after I was so mad all my life at him for failing as a dad, it was redemption. It was absolute redemption for my dad because nobody could have withstood all those variables that came together to crack him up.
Hmm.
And telling it has helped me. My siblings are not that interested in this telling because it was such a dark time, and they don't they said we're all fine. What's the big deal? But it was a big deal for me. I'm the oldest, and they don't see this as significant. But when you're the oldest, I thought I need to keep these people alive because dad's going to kill us. If he's having a bad day, dad's going to kill us. So I had it in my head from the time I was 5 that I needed to protect my family. And it was delusional. I wouldn't have been able to do that, but I wouldn't stay all night at people's houses, and I'm hyper aware. I can read a room. I can walk in a room and take the temperature because I didn't know if it was a good dad day or a bad dad day. So, come in, he'd be in his chair, lounger in his boxer shorts, and I just kind of feel the atmosphere to see if I'm going to have to walk on eggshells today. But I wasn't able to protect everybody because of the police incident, and by that time, I was teaching deaf children, and I had a child. I had a one-year-old, your buddy, my son, Win, and, uh, I couldn't protect everybody, and when he finally totally lost his mind, there were casualties, and that also made me feel very guilty. And my husband came to get me at school, and then we heard on the radio, this was news, what
Hmm.
what my dad did. The first thing I said to my mom when I walked in, and not till I wrote this book did I understand why I said that. I walked in and I said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I was apologizing for letting the team down.
Hmm.
I couldn't prevent it." And I didn't think about that till I wrote this book. And so when we write our stories, and I know, Mike, you're going to be writing your story as well, things that happen come into this light of, I never thought about it that way.
Hmm.
And it brings peace. It brings it brings peace and closure, understanding, and in my case, Miss Mouthy, compassion for what my mom went through, what my dad went through, and what my siblings went through.
Hmm. And that's you've actually touched on a lot of things just in that that I see a lot of veterans deal with. I've had veterans on the show who've uh, by the VA has designated them as um, I would say belligerents, and so they have a hard time getting care because yeah they get very angry um, at the bureaucracy, and I've seen where the VA will purposefully try to like touch that nerve with them to try to get them go off. Um,
Mm.
Also, another thing you talked about, I've been very open. I've been in therapy ongoing since 2016. I really have not stopped, other than when the VA took away my doctors. Uh, but I always once I recognized I had an issue, I wanted to get better. Uh, but I know that there's a lot of veterans out there who get very frustrated. They want to get better, but they don't know how. And so I think you've touched on that. But another thing that I think is a good thing that you touched on is a conversation I had with my therapist as we were talking about my son. And my therapist was like, "You don't need to worry. Your son's going to be fine." At a very early age, he's seen you with your struggle. He's dealt with, your ex-wife, and he's learning at an early age how to deal with difficult things and difficult people. So he's going to take survival skills into his adult life that he's been taught at a young age. So he was like, "Don't worry at all." And I think you've kind of demonstrated that with this story.
And I want to point out too that your son sounds like he's resilient, and resilience with PTSD and resilience with the children is very important. Also, you're a very loving father, and I'm assuming hands-on with your son, and having that connection it is going to help him greatly because he sees the good in you. And in my case, my father wasn't hands-on at all. You know,
Hmm.
he was in his own world. There was a recently a wonderful CBS Sunday morning special feature called Children of War, and I'd never heard that term before. The children of PTSD veterans, and they interviewed the families. And there was a teenage boy who was the oldest in the family, and he had been extremely affected by his father's PTSD to the point of desperation. And it made me cry to see this wonderful young man um, having to deal because what we feel like is I need to fix you. I must help you. I can make you whole and better and you can have your psyche back, which we cannot do.
Hmm.
But I think that's often with kids. But because you're a communicator and you're in therapy, and I have been in therapy for my own depression resulting from the death of my dad and other incidences in life I think that you're able to show your son the way with the tools that you've learned in therapy, and that will help him greatly. Some children don't have that. So this term "children of war" to me was so significant because we were not on the radar of concern because dad was the big storm in our life and we had to deal with him in and out of psych wards, in and out of the VA. Coming, I never knew where's dad? Oh, he's at the VA and he'll be there 6 months. I never knew what was happening with him. So, with this Children of War, April now is designated as the month of the military child. And so the children in the families are being recognized. And that's when I'm speaking at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus on behalf of the month of the military child. And the children are now having an opportunity there for StoryCorps where they learn to tell their own stories, talk with their parents in the military about service, or talk with their friends who are in the military, friends of the family. And then those stories will be stored at the Library of Congress. So the children now are getting attention and recognized by the VA that this goes down through the family. The war does not stop at the door.
Absolutely.
The war continues.
And I do want to remind everyone that if you're watching, if you're a veteran, definitely reach out for help. And if you're willing to deal with the issues honestly, openly, and just be willing to try things, it does absolutely get better. It'll be a hard fought, but you gotta take those steps. And for those who are in a crisis, veterans, military, and their families, you can always reach out and use the Battle Buddies app. If you use the Battle Buddies app, you'll reach out to a veteran like myself who's been through a lot of this stuff and just be able to talk to someone who understands. So I just want to get that plug out there for people. Um, I do want to talk a little bit about the Veteran Memorial Museum and this event. I've got the flyer up here. Let me show it again for everyone. So
Thank you.
the dates on this, it's April 10th,
Ninth.
9th. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and it's just a series of talks and programs.
They do a lot of programming to support the resilience of veterans. And their whole purpose there is to tell the individual stories from service members from every branch of service. So they have They have these beautiful exhibits, they have stories, they have videos, they have uniforms and things like that, and then art exhibits too. And this will be a talk that I do and a book signing there. And they're going to have somebody at the very end for a few minutes from the VA, I hope that they're still on staff, come and talk about what is happening right now with PTSD with
Mhm.
service. They have a lovely following and they have a bookstore there. The bookstore, interestingly, their bylaws or whatever, all the books need to be written by service members. But I submitted my book because my dad couldn't tell a story.
Yeah.
He couldn't possibly tell a story, but I can. And so I said, please consider give me a dispensation of I'm telling my dad's story. And I think the military families need to be considered. That's what's happening now, too, is mercifully people are understanding the veterans' needs and the support that we must give our veterans and how telling our stories are so important to our mental health. It's
Mhm.
difficult. It was difficult for me to ever speak about what happened in our house. It was I would cry. I would just cry, to talk about it, but it got easier and easier. That first that first connection, that first phone call, they talk about in the rooms of the, support groups, the telephone weighs 4,000 pounds to pick up that first time. It's the last thing you wanna do when we're in psychic pain is to talk to it's like, I just wanna be in bed. I can't do it, but I am begging any of your viewers, your good viewers, your loyal people, if you're in crisis, if you're in need, please make the call. Please do it for yourself and for the people who love you. It works. It works. It's not easy work. It's hard work.
Mhm.
But you got to this point with PTSD because you were working hard.
Yeah.
You were dealing with things that normal citizens do not deal with. And I love when they talk about PTSD and that it is a crisis of the soul. It's a crisis of our humanity because in wartime, in the service, there are things that happen that is not normal life. And the soul is crushed. And so it is soul work that we have to do, and we help each other. And it's why I wrote this, because I'm hearing from people stories related to the service, related to mental health in the family. One man, Christopher, wrote to me about his brother who enlisted when he was 18 years old in the Navy. He was in the Navy 2 days and was washed off a ship
Hmm.
in a storm. And this was in 1970. And he said, reading this helped him to reformulate everything that happened to this young man, his brother. So I, I'm telling you, a dollar from every book goes to the StoryCorps program. There's very little money to be made from publishing a book, believe me, but I know it helps people. I know I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I've heard from people.
And that's you have touched on, there's and I've dealt with this with other veterans of kind of being down on veterans who did not serve in a wartime area or any type of combat. I've had stolen valor groups by doing this show come after me and say, "Oh, he doesn't have a combat action ribbon, so he lied that he's a combat vet." Well, that's not how you define a combat vet. But a lot of the things that happen to us uh, are not combat related. I can tell you in May of 2010, there was a fire aboard Camp Leatherneck while I was deployed, and we almost lost the whole camp. And it's incidents like that that are like the big incidents when, you know, I talk to my therapist or when I talk to other veterans, we talk about those type of things, and rarely ever they actually war stories. It's just things that as life happens, and the military is a very dangerous job.
And oftentimes, and I have not been in the military, uh, but oftentimes going into an institution such as that can break your spirit because of training, because perhaps a leader was less than professional. Perhaps you were a woman who had been harassed in the service, and perhaps you're a person who is um, just a shy individual who'd been made into a different type of person and they've lost their sense of self. Combat is horrible. I had an uncle because I tried to find out from my relatives what's going on with my. Do you know? I mean, you served in a office job in Hawaii. My uncle. I said, he's in some explosion at a base. How? And my uncle blew it off. He's like, no, your dad's just crazy. Your dad's just crazy. He wasn't in war. It was during a war, but he's not in war. And he poo-pooed all of that. I mean, also, my dad had there were four brothers altogether. Three were in in the service during the war. That's a little stressful too. And one is blown off a ship the year before in Pearl Harbor and lives. And when you have an explosion and your brother has been blown off a ship, I don't know. I can connect those dots and say the people there thought they were under attack. It was the first thing that came to their mind. We're under attack. And they didn't know till the next day what had happened. So this combat non-combat thing, or why are you depressed?
Mhm.
You're the kid and you've never served. Also, my dad was he was disorganized about everything school wise, never got to school on time. But when it came to the GI Bill, he found out I could go to school on the GI Bill because he was 100% disabled. And so he did everything, paperwork, scheduled the appointment in Cincinnati, got me down there. I had to take a test. And I thought, what do I have to do? Push ups, jump out of an airplane? And I took the test and I got the GI Bill, which I felt guilty about because I didn't serve. And I stood in line at Ohio University with Vietnam vets, and they were older guys. I was 17, and they were older guys, and some of them had their fatigue things on and red bandanas. This is 1970, height of everything. And this one man turned around, and his name was Stan Rooney, and he said, "Were you in Vietnam?" And I said, "No." And I looked like I was 12 years old. I said, "My dad was in the service. My dad's mentally ill, and I get the GI Bill too." Because I was like, I had this pat phrase to tell my roommates, and he took me under his wing when we had to stand in that line, and he'd walk me home to my dorm. And he was probably 25, 26. Never anything other than shepherding me. And then they started mailing the checks, and I really never saw him again. But I put this in the book. Sometimes angels wear khaki. And this guy was an angel to me. And those men in that line, I could feel their energy and pain. They were completely silent and they had lost their life in their face.
Mhm.
Stan had not. These guys did. I'll never forget that as long as I live, waiting for that check. And I'm beholden to the government for the support of the GI Bill because I went on to become a speech therapist. I taught deaf children, I taught at the university, and then I became a writer and a performer after that. And the thing I love about any of my shows is somebody will come up and say, I needed that laugh more than you'll ever know. And I see that as my responsibility to the GI Bill. I am here to lift spirits and do good. And when we have purpose, as you do, Mike, with this show of connecting people with services, lifting spirits, bringing humor, you're on a mission, man. And I'm proud of you.
It it's actually been very healing for my PTSD. It forces me to confront things sometimes that I've avoided confronting, and avoidance is a big part of PTSD. That's why so many veterans don't go for help. So it it absolutely
I
gets
wanted to
better.
ask you, I wanted to ask you, Mike, when you, and I've seen some of your shows, when you have your shows, are there any times that someone is in complete pain where you must help them live on the show deal with the crisis that they are experiencing in their emotions?
Um, we've talked about some heavy things live on the show, and my co-host TC, he's an 82nd Airborne vet. It's gotten heavy before, but honestly, with most shows, uh, when I go off the air, because as you can see in the below, I've get an email. I've also got a Google Voice number where people can text me. Also, I'm very open on my social media. I'll get bombarded some days with messages from people after I end the show. You know, it's nothing they want to talk about live, but they do want to talk about. So I'll get all types of people who reach out to me for just various things after the show ends.
Well, it's very therapeutic, and if any of your viewers have questions for me about the book, to send to Mike, and I'm happy to answer those too. And if you do read the book, you can get through to Mike or the publisher, and I'm very happy to answer any of your comments, reviews. If you're mad at me about something, you know, have at it.
Well, I do want everyone to know the link to the book is in the description of today's video. Also, so you can go onto Amazon, buy it there. Also, April 9th, 6 p.m. at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum right there in Columbus, Ohio. You can be there and you can be there when Patricia is presenting. Uh, I would imagine you'll have copies of the book to purchase.
Copies of the book there after a nice talk, and make a reservation because they want to make sure that they have the proper seating. It's free with, if you can, a suggested donation of $10 to the StoryCorps project, but that is not a requirement at all. We want people to come there and to be elevated and to connect with each other at this beautiful museum that was the inspiration of John Glenn. So there was an old vets memorial and a new vets memorial. This is the new, and John Glenn was the person who put all of this in motion.
And also, if you buy a book while you're there, $1 of every book sale will go to the StoryCorps Children's Project at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. So it's a great event. So I encourage everyone, if you're going to be in the Columbus, Ohio area, or if you live there, definitely check it out. Um, Also, buy a copy of the book because I haven't finished it. You just sent it to me yesterday. I'm going through,
Yeah.
but yeah, just looking through, I can tell it's incredibly interesting talking with you about a lot of these issues. Is it, it I know that I'm going to get a big response on this video, so um, I thank
I
you.
hope so.
Go ahead.
I hope so. And just to wrap up, and Rod Serling did the Twilight Zone shows, and they were talked about humanity a lot, the and the crisis of the heart. He was a paratrooper in World War II, and he said that he wrote in order to get it out of his head and onto the paper. That's why I'm asking people, tell your stories. Your stories are magic. Tell them.
And one amazing thing about the the Twilight Zone, a lot of those show ideas came from real life. So,
Yeah. Yes.
but again,
They're very smart.
the author is Patricia Wynn Brown. The book is Royal Roots: Reimagining a Life Through Humor, a Castle, and the U.S. Navy. And the event is at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio. Highly encourage everyone to check it out, buy a copy of the book. Uh, Patricia, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mike.
If you write anything else or if you do anything else, feel free to come back to us. Um, Likewise, if you meet anyone there you think would be great for the show, feel free to send them my way. We're always happy to have people who are doing exciting and interesting things on the show.
Thank you so much, Mike, and continued good luck to you and love to your son and your family.
Oh, thank you. And to all of you out there, thank you so much for watching today's show. I encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, definitely leave them in the video comment section. I will get to every single one. And thank you all. If you're struggling, reach out. Don't suffer alone. And as always, thank you for being worth serving.